I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to mix drums from a stereo source. What I've got within this project is an Ultrabeat track which is playing all of the drum sounds within the drum mix of this project, and that's fine until we want to apply individual effects to those drum instruments. Let's hear the track first and then we'll see how that might present a problem. Okay, short and sweet track. Now what we can see is that up here at the top I've got the Nouveau Disco kit from Ultrabeat, which is playing all of the drums within my project, and if I double click on it I can see the MIDI that I've programmed for this part, and if we listen to it by itself we'll hear, as I said, all of the drum sounds coming from this one individual instance of Ultrabeat. Okay, and that's fine. Certainly while I'm programming, it's really nice to have all of my drum sounds under my fingers at once. But what if at the mix stage I want to add a compressor to the kick drum but not to the snare? What if I want to add reverb to the snare but not the kick drum? All of the individual sounds within this drum mix might benefit from an individual mix treatment. And of course, if I add effects to the overall Ultrabeat instrument, they're going to affect all of the sounds within the mix of this project. And by the way, if you're working with an external drum machine, you have exactly the same problem. You've got one track where all of the sounds are being generated in one place, they're being played back from one instrument, but you want to be able to mix them independently. So whether you're working with Ultrabeat or whether you're working with external drum modules, the same rules apply. So there are a couple of ways that I can solve this problem. The first way is that I could multiply copy Ultrabeat. So what I'm going to do is to rename this track Kick, even though it still contains all of my drums. In a minute, it's only going to contain the kick drum, so I'm going to just relabel that now. What I'm then going to do is to duplicate this track. The duplicate track button is here at the top of the track list, and when I click on this, what's going to happen is I'm going to get another absolute duplicate of this instrument with the same kit loaded, and I can call this one Snare. Now what I'm going to do is to simply copy that down to here, and now I've got two separate drum tracks, and I can keep going. I've got hats within this project as well, or this drum track I should say. So I'm going to call this hats. What else have I got? I can see the list of instruments here. I've got a mid-tom. So I could go through and I could copy this one as well. I'm going to call this track mid-tom, and I can keep going like this until I've got tracks for every single instrument. Now what I'd have to do would be to go through and strip out the MIDI so that I only had the drum for each individual track on each track that I've created. So how do I do that? Well, if this is going to be just the kick track, then I can come through, select all of the notes here that aren't the kick, because the MIDI out light is on. As I start to drag over these, all of these notes are going to play. So what I'm going to do is to switch it off so that we don't get this cacophony of sounds. I'm simply going to select all of the notes that aren't the kick drum, which is down here at the bottom, and I can throw that away, and that is now just the kick track. And I could relabel this by holding down Shift and Option and N, and what that will do is to relabel the region based on the track name that I gave it. I can then do the same thing for the snare. This time what I'm going to need to do is to throw away the kick drum and then select all the notes above it, and I can go through, and now that's just the snare drum, and again I can relabel it. Now if I just solo those two sounds, we'll see the benefit of this. This is now just the kick track and this is just the snare. And what that might mean, for instance, I think the example I gave would be, what would I do if I wanted to put maybe a compressor on this kick that didn't affect the snare drum? So here is our compressor, and what I could do would be to configure settings for the kick drum, which of course are going to completely not affect the snare in any way, because that sound is now on a separate track. So now I've got my kick compression. So one solution to the problem that I had would be to go through and create multiple Ultrabeats for every single track that exists within my project. But what if you're working with a third-party drum plugin like BFD3 or Superior Drummer, something like that, which is really memory intensive? Do you really want to go through and create lots and lots of versions of that same plugin over and over again just to isolate individual drums? Well, it could be that the benefit or the best way of achieving the result that we've started by duplicating tracks in this way would be better achieved by actually converting every individual drum sound to audio. In other words, what I'm going to do is to print every single drum separately onto a new audio track. Now, of course, what that means is that my opportunities to sort of change the benefits of the MIDI pattern are going to be limited. But if I'm really sure that my drum pattern is fixed and it's working and I like it, then there is no disadvantage to me turning those files into audio. And of course, I don't actually have to throw the MIDI away. If I decide later that actually I want a fill or a change or something different, I could go back and reprogram it. And again, I can split it out. So let's look at that approach instead. What I'm going to do is to unmute these tracks. I'm going to select these three, which I don't need anymore. I'm going to come back here and select these three tracks here instead, and I'm going to just relabel this drums. And because I haven't stripped any of the MIDI out of this region, we're kind of back to where we started. So instead what I could do would be to do this. I'm going to double click this MIDI again, and again I'm going to select everything that isn't the kick drum and I'm going to mute it. Control M to mute that part. And what I'm then going to do is to control click this region, and what I'm going to do is to select bounce in place. Now what this is going to do is to turn this MIDI region into an audio file. If you find that bounce in place isn't in the list of the 5 most recent sort of commands that you've used, instead what you can do is to come down to bounce and join, and you'll find bounce in place at the top of the list. And when I select that option, what I have a chance to do is to bounce this file out as a new audio track. I'm going to call it kick. And what I'm going to do for now is to leave the original MIDI file. Rather than muting it, I'm going to leave it so it's going to stay exactly as it is. And having labeled this file kick, I can then press OK. What that's going to do is to create an audio file of just the kick, because it was the only file that was playing. And because I left this alone, I now don't need to unmute it. What I can do instead is to come back, mute the kick drums, which I've now turned into an audio file, click on this snare drum sound here, and what I'm going to do is to hit Control and M again, which is going to unmute that file, and then I can repeat that process. Bounce in place again, this time I can call this snare drum, and very quickly what I can do is to keep returning to my original file. I'm going to hit M again, or Command M, and this time what I can do is to select the hi-hat, and if I wanted to, I could decide that I wanted to print the hi-hat maybe with the tambourine, because they're sort of part of the same sound world. So what I could do would be to select this note as well and also unmute that so that they're part of the same thing. And I could then again just hit bounce in place, and I could call this hat and tambourine, and just hit OK, and that will just print that file. And every time I come back to these individual parts, of course, I can just come back and print each individual part separately. So that definitely gives me the opportunity to think about the sort of splitting out of all of the individual drums in a way that's then going to give me a lot of flexibility, because each part will be printed separately. I'm just going to do one more of these. I'm going to just print this cabasa part as well. And then we've got that part separately. Now, of course, I could leave some of this as MIDI. If I decided, for instance, that actually maybe this tom part here, or the ride cymbal that's within this track, I wanted to leave as MIDI on the original track, well, that's fine. That can run side by side with these other individual parts. But what I've now got is each individual drum sound printed separately as its own audio file. And of course, it's going to sound exactly the same as it did before. But now I can see the benefit of one thing that I talked about doing right at the beginning, which is to add some reverb to just the snare drum. And of course, that's not going to affect the kick or the hats or the cabasa or any of the other drums, because it's just on its own track. So within this video, we've looked at one way in which it's possible to take a stereo programmed drum track and to then think about switching to the kind of mix stage of all of those individual drum pieces. How can we separate those parts so that I can apply different techniques to the kick and the snare and the hats and so on and so forth? There are two ways I can do that. I can either duplicate that original part multiple times and then go through and strip the MIDI so that each individual instrument plays back on its own track, or I can convert each part to audio. And if I'm happy with the programming that I've completed, and I'm sure that the pattern is fixed and finished, then there's no disadvantage to doing that. And remember, if I decided at any stage that what I wanted to do would be to go back and change my pattern, remember, all of this MIDI data is still available. I can select it all, I can unmute it, and I can go through exactly the same process again, having created a fill or indeed completely rethought the programming if I wanted to change it.